Wir dürfen heute Veronika Wittmann begrüßen. Veronika Wittmann ist assoziierte Universitätsprofessorin für Global Studies am Institut für Neuere Geschichte und Zeitgeschichte und am Institut für Kulturwirtschaft und Kulturforschung der Johannes Kepler Universität. Sie ist Doktorandin der Österreichischen Akademie der Wissenschaften von 2000 bis 2001 gewesen, hat zum Thema Weltgesellschaft habilitiert und hat bereits diverse Wissenschaftspreise bekommen, von der Österreichischen Gesellschaft der Soziologie, den Wissenschaftspreis der besten Dissertation 2004, den Dr. Leopold Kuschak Wissenschaftspreis 2003, den Kepler Wissenschaftspreis 2002, den Wissenschaftspreis der Dr. Maria Schaumeier Stiftung 2002. Sie ist für Kooperationen mit afrikanischen Partneruniversitäten der Johannes Kepler Universität zuständig. Und Professor Wittmann hat die österreichweite Leitung für das Sustainable Development Goal 17, also Partnerships for the Goals, der Vereinten Nationen beim Uninetz. Ihre Forschungsschwerpunkte umfassen Globalisierung und Weltgesellschaft, Digital Diplomacy, Science Diplomacy, Sustainable Development, Gender and Development Studies mit dem regionalen Schwerpunkt Subsahara-Afrika. Und damit dürfen wir nun an die Frau Professor Wittmann übergeben für ihren Vortrag Global Sustainable Development, SDG 17 Matters.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. It's quite interesting to hear of your different backgrounds. I can see you're studying different subjects, and it's really a pleasure to be among all of you today and share ideas on global sustainable development, SDG 17 matters. It's kind of interesting because the SDGs as an overall concept were, proclaimed in 2015. And if we look at some of the critical landscapes at this point of time, looking at facts and figures, you can really see at various parts on Earth, across continents, a political trend that nationalism is globalizing. Looking at Brazil and Latin America, Hungary or Poland and Europe, in Asia, Philippines, Russia, another example. And one very famous, very popular proponent of this kind of attitude of being a patriot was the former ex-US President Donald Trump. And let me quote him by mentioning his address to the United Nations General Assembly in 2019. He was addressing the world audience there by the following words. He was stating, "Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots." So what Donald Trump and others of these politicians, of these nationalist governments here clearly would argue, get away, get rid of the SDG 17, due to the fact, because they are very much having a kind of policy which could be labeled as unilateralism. Unilateralism, as you see here, is the process or fact of deciding a policy or action without involving another group or country, where the counter program would be multilateralism, which would be a situation in which several different countries or organizations work together to achieve something or deal with a problem. So if we carefully listen to this kind of nationalism, which is globalizing throughout various continents, crossing various continents, we can actually have the implication, do we need to say farewell to multilateralism? And are we entering a political scenario where every nation is for itself, as Ian Bremmer has published a book on this G0 world which we are facing. Taking a look at the SDGs, and I'm happy that you already had some meetings before working on the SDGs. We can actually raise the questions if the Sustainable Development Goals are a counter-program to unilateralism. As an overall view, and I suppose all of you are aware of this fact, is the SDGs are as much as the former framework of the Millennium Development Goals, which the United Nations and all of the member states have proclaimed in 2000, and the follow-up program, the SDGs in 2015, they are unique in the history of global politics. Never ever before was there a consensus among all UN member states, and there was no state in the world left out. All of UN member states had a consensus on the fact that development and environment are inseparable. So you cannot talk of environment without talking of development, and vice versa. It was also clearly proclaimed there will be no preservation of the ecosystems on the earth without overcoming poverty. So what we see in the SDGs, this three dimension of the social dimension, economic parts, and ecological dimension coming together is clearly stated here. And as well, the goals are interconnected. If I look now and say, okay, are they a program for unilateralism or multilateralism? It is quite clear and obvious that for all of these various goals, and they are quite an ambitious program, I doubt among some of the goals that the world really will manage to achieve it. The fact is, it is still the states who have to put programs and to see, okay, are we following up that the world really will have in 2030, very ambitious goal, nobody on earth lives in extreme poverty anymore, or that we can really, you know, rise the number of specifically girl education in various countries of the world. So in that sense, actually, it is still in the hand of the states to fulfill all of these up to 16 SDGs, and unique in this sense is goal number 17, simply because of the fact it is the goal for multilateralism. It does have a focus on global cooperation, on multilateralism, and it is the one and only goal that is kind of like, you know, a trademark, a benchmark, if countries, states, and other actors are capable of not only looking what their given nation state does, but how far are we capable of accepting that only avec multilateralism efforts, avec global cooperation, we will actually manage all of the other goals as well. The SDGs have, SDG 7 is no exception, have a lot of targets in order to see how far the world's different states has come to reach these goals. SDG 17 has 19 different targets covering a wide range of area, from finance to technology and innovation, capacity building, trade, up to systematic issue like policy and institutional coherence. Formally, SDG 7 proclaims to strengthen the means of implementation and to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. This is the official trademark for SDG 17. And in my short insight this evening, I would like to take two targets specifically out of this SDG 17 and look up how far did the world come so far. The first target is a target which will be, like all of the others, reviewed at the high-level political forum by the United Nations every year. And the first target is actually a very, very old target, a very old kind of application. What the OECD countries, the so-called developed industrial gas countries, promised actually since more than nearly 15 years now. And this is the target to put 0.7% of their gross national income to official development assistance. So SDG 17 here in this target again calls for what OECD countries have long time been promising. And the other target, which I would like to give you a short insight, is the target which deals more with a systemic issue, which is the multi-stakeholder approach. Let me just have a quick look on the target of this famous 0.7 official development assistance. Here you see a statistic of all the 29 DAC members, the Development Assistance Committee members, which are countries by the OECD world, how much they devoted actually of their gross national income to official development assistance in 2018. The countries, all the OECD countries, have to report it every year to the DAC committee, which sits in Paris. And you can see here, it's quite a very triste picture, actually. If you think this promise is now 50 years old, and you see here the line, the green line would be the target to give 0.7% of gross national income to official development assistance. You actually can see it's always the very famous Scandinavian countries being in the forefront, but here you have only 4 states out of this group of 29 DAC members who really kept this promise. So this gives us a picture. I cannot say anything else than so much for broken promises. And I would also maybe later to discuss with you how sustainable this target is anyway. Because one can actually think in the 21st century, the program should not be so much focused on development assistance, specifically not on bilateral development assistance, but there are definitely other ways to reach more like a sustainable and fair world. For instance, debt relief would be a big step forward for a lot of countries in the global south, as well as this whole notion of keeping up fair trade. And this, of course, relates back to countries like Austria, to put more effort into debt relief and to proclaim and fair trade in the world. Besides this fact, it is also a given reality, this whole budget volume that OECD countries put to development assistance and so far transfer money to countries in the global south, the number of remittances, which is the number that migrants send back to the country of their origin, most of the times to countries in the global south or countries who are economically not so strong, is 3 times higher than the whole budget of this order volume being transferred here from the OECD world to countries in the global south. So this is not much a success story for sustainable development. I would like to give you now a short insight, combine SDG 17 with a kind of more like theoretical framework. Considering all these global risks of the 21st century, there are numerous universal challenges endangering humanity and influencing global politics as well as international relations. A lot of these issues are environmental issues. If you think of the loss of biodiversity, climate change, COVID-19, the current pandemic, which is also related to environmental destruction. And if the world will not manage to reduce, giving space or taking away space from wild animals, COVID-19 definitely will not be the last pandemic humanity will face in this century. You can also raise technological issues like the lack of contemporary technology governance, which is a big challenge to humanity. I would like to make the statement here that science has to take all of these needs into account and to contribute with profound expertise to academic discussion. And a main thesis here is any nation state related or disciplinary solo effort will definitely not provide adequate answers to how humanity can manage and cope with the global risks of this century. You can see here in the cartoon, you can imagine a small container like a nation state and then another nation state. And like the one says, oh, think outside the box. And he said, oh, you first, so I'm not the one. In the 21st century, for me, it is quite clear that faced with these global challenges, universal threats, any kind of nation state related thinking, meaning thinking inside a small container, as well as solo efforts by specific scientific disciplines, will definitely not provide answers which could put humanity a little more forward. But it calls for cross-disciplinary science, and it calls for, in that sense, much more international scientific discourses. And one theoretical framework, I don't want to put you too much into, from my background, I'm a sociologist, but I'd like to combine the SDG 17 a little bit in a societal perspective. And one theory which is, I think, quite suitable to fit into this goal of global cooperation, multilateralism, is the framework for World Risk Society as being articulated by the German sociologist Ulrich Beck. SDG 17 contains a whole lot of targets that are a seismograph, how far states are willing to implement multilateralism. And there is definitely an urgent need for multilateral action if we think on this framework that we are all living in a world risk society. The statement here is we have universal threats. Humanity is faced by these global challenges which are cross-bordering by nature. So we have challenges which are not regional challenges, not local challenges, not nation-state related challenges, but they are global by nature. Just to give you one example, of course, Austria can have excellent nation-state environmental laws, but at the end of the day, it will not help quite a lot because contaminants transcend nation-state borders. And this relates to a lot of other global challenges. And in World Risk Society, Ulrich Beck puts an ethical reference point. And in his understanding, it's simply the survival of humanity. This is located on a civilizational volcano. And the universality of risks actually leads to the enforcement, to international cooperation. This is an old idea already being articulated by Immanuel Kant 220 years ago. He used this German word of Zwangscosmopolitanism. So whether states like it or not, in order to survive, they are forced to cooperate, the enforcement to international cooperation. And Ulrich Beck puts quite an interesting, provocative perspective. He also sees something very positive in these global challenges, in those universal contemporary problems, like be genetic engineering, atomic energy, the ozone hole. They all lever out classical questions of your sociology, simply because due to the fact that faced with ecological hazards, technological changes, these so-called old inequalities between poor, rich, center, periphery are no more of central importance. And this is quite provocative, you know, for him being a sociologist, because we always try to look at social issues, social circumstances. But of course, everybody can understand an atomic catastrophe, as the world has seen in Chernobyl in 1986, or in the last years, Fukushima. An atomic catastrophe affects every human being, regardless what age group you belong, regardless of your sex, whatever kind of profession you have. So the statement here is, in the 21st century, due to this you know, global threats, they also raise different questions in science, because these global threats have a more equalizing moment, and that is that we all live in a world hazard community. Ulrich Beck himself, I just put one quotation from his book on World Risk Society, says, I quote him now, "Social misery can be excluded, global threats no longer." This is quite clear if you think of, if you do, for instance, social research only in a small nation-state container of Austria, you will not even see that the world, or there are people in the world living in extreme poverty, because evidently we don't have extreme poverty in Austria. This is what he meant. Social misery can be excluded. You don't have to see it. Just stay in your container, and then all the other stuff is not obvious to be seen. But then comes his point, hunger is hierarchical, but global warming is egalitarian and insofar, with quotations, democratic. Not meaning that, you know, the 8 billion people on Earth voted for global warming, but he says, in the end of the day, these global threats like global climate change, loss of biodiversity, all the other issues also have something positive, because there is an equalizing moment at the back of the story. And henceforth, in World Risk Society, global risks can be interpreted as a driving force for multilateralism, and global risks and their practical and discursive treatment create something that would not have been created if the global risks were not there, and this is transnational communities. So in World Risk Society, global risks actually force a rethink. Like I said before, if they were not there, people would actually maybe need to invent it in order to get more universal, a global perspective. And what I'd like to present you here now is to combine this theoretical approach of World Risk Society with the SDG 17, the Partnership for the Goals. Deeply based into this thesis is the main argument that sustainable development needs global cooperation. The first fact is the SDGs address all member states. This is quite a difference to the former framework of the Millennium Development Goals. They were mainly focused on countries in the global south. With the SDGs, we have really no country left out in the world. All of the UN member states are really addressed. And here I put you an old photograph from 1968, very famous picture being taken, which is called the Earthrise, which is the first picture, the first photographic humanity has from planet Earth. It's been taken from the orbit of the moon. And you can see our beautiful blue planet here coming up. And actually, in this sense, it always calls for a global perspective, like to perceive our planet as one, which is very prominent in our environmental discussions as well. And of course, you will also know the slogan that global problems need global solutions. You cannot solve a global problem with only, you know, little local or nation-state related solutions. The theoretical framework, which I was talking as well before, you see here on a graphic, World Risk Society, stated by Ulrich Beck, contains of three main global risks: transnational terrorism, financial hazards, which we've all seen the world in 2008 with the fall of the Lehman Brothers, and then environmental risks. And in World Risk Society, sustainable development is a driving force for cosmopolitanism. These global risks have, in this sense, the effects that they cause global commonalities. They urge, in a short or long-term perspective, they urge for cooperative international institutions, which is something that SDG 16 also calls for, having strong institutions that are capable of governing all these risks. They also create, I will later come to this point, they create a global civil society. And last but not least, global risk create transnational communities. So more and more people become aware of the fact that they share pretty much in common, and you don't look at any kind of, division part. So that would be like the theoretical framework combines with SDG on the main basic background that any sustainable development is in urgent need of global cooperation. Of course, it's very nice always to put something on a theoretical agenda, but the difficult thing is always the implementation. And this remains quite the big challenge up to now. The SDGs can be seen as a strong rhetorical agenda of the international community. SDG 17 specifically, another proclamation, oh yeah, we need to cooperate, we need to work on a global scale, we need to create new partnerships, fill this life in. And SDG 17 clearly addresses this multi-stakeholder partnerships for the goals. It addresses governments, the private sector, civil society, and of course, partnership among these various stakeholders is a very complex task. You have different kind of maybe organizational background, you have maybe talk, somehow a different kind of language, and this makes the whole thing very difficult for the implementation. Another fact which I think is pretty much a wide area on the landscape of the SDGs is it is a fact that states are the main political players for the implementation of the goals. And we're living in a world where if you look at the global political landscape, we do have first, what I mentioned in the beginning, this rising of nationalism and nationalist governments. And another argument which is quite serious here is the topic of failing or failed states. So colleagues from political science say, for instance, on the African continent, nearly 25% of the states, 1/4 of the states, can be labeled as failing or already failed states. If you think of Democratic Republic of Congo, you all know these countries in Asia, Afghanistan, Yemen, which is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe we are currently observing. So who is taken care of? It was like a result from the MDGs already that those states who are labeled as failing or failed states also fall back in their socioeconomic development, which is quite clear. If the state does not have the monopoly of power anymore, they will always have it more difficult to reach all of the SDG targets actually at the end of the day. And also one part is the lack of data, which makes the implementation very difficult. Only from the last report the United Nations have been publishing on this high-level political forum, Currently, only 141 states actually were implementing national statistics plan. That means 45 states are still not having national statistic plans in 2019. And of course, if you don't have national statistic plans, if you have a lack of data, you also cannot measure the progress. How far are you on your way to reach some of the targets? And I mean, 55 states is, just to give you an idea, is the number of states being members of the African Union, or 2 times the states we have in the European Union. So it's not a small number we are talking about here. And of course, states are the main political actors, but let me come now to the target, the second target I want to give you an insight to, which is this multiple stakeholder approach to implement multilateralism. Formally, the SDGs, SDG 17, states that any successful sustainable development agenda requires inclusive partnerships between the stakeholders of governments, states, the private sector, and civil society. And all of these inclusive partnerships should build on principles and values, a shared vision, shared goals that put people and the planet at the center. And all of these partnerships always need to take place at 4 different levels. At the global level, the so-called inter-transnational global level, the regional level, meaning world regions, the national level, state-focused level, and of course at community level, at a local level. So this is the kind of proclamation what multiple stakeholdership is all about. And if we are now looking who is a fast on the track to say to implement multilateralism among these multiple stakeholders, the rising and the globalization of nationalism, what we have seen in the last decade, is endangering any kind of multilateralism. So a large number of states are not the best performers. They somehow, you know, put all of their, you know, America first, whatever, France first, whatever state you can mention first. This is not a way how you can really make a good performance of any kind of multilateral action. Of course, SDG 17, as I said before, is a seismograph of how states are taking global cooperation and multilateral action seriously. And one can also state that no country in the world can manage on its own the challenges of the 21st century. And at the moment, a quite high number of states are not the best performers of global cooperation in the context of the implementation of the SDGs, but another stakeholder is, and that is global civil society. We've seen a variety of transnational networks, diverse age groups, representatives of civil society worldwide that demonstrate that people are capable to cooperate on a global scale. And you can see on this side of the states where we have this nationalism is globalizing, civil society and the private sector as being another stakeholder are in this performance aware of the fact that global challenges in this century can only be tackled by multilateral cooperation. To give you one example from the private sector, one of the biggest philanthropic organizations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, was very, very successful in the fight against malaria, which is, you know, a lot of countries in the global south are still suffering from malaria, a disease where you can actually have, with a lot of medical research, easily to piece, and you can also have malaria nets and so on and so on. So here it was not the world of states working together, but we've also seen in the current pandemic that the World Health Organization is struggling a lot, but you have civil society philanthropic organizations coming in and taking place, actually what one could argue would be the responsibility of states. So private sector comes in, and which is the hope on World Risk Society as well, of Ulrich Beck and others of these cosmopolitan attitudes, the global civil society. So people all over the world create transnational political spaces, and by doing so, reshape global politics. I'm pretty much aware that the world would not have the Paris Climate Agreement being signed in 2050 if there would not have been such a strong civil society commitment who always push states, push governments way forward, especially with regard to environmental issues. They were quite successful. Here you just see photos being taken at all continents. Millions of people participated in 5,000 events in 156 states of the world ahead of the United Nations Climate Summit in September 2019. And this is something we have seen, like now this presentation is recorded by Scientists for Future. We all know this transnational movement of Fridays for Future. This is not only taking place in Luxembourg, in Burkina Faso, and in I don't know, in Nepal. It is really like a transnational movement of a younger generation claiming to have their part and a fair part on sustainability, to live in a world still with environment which is good for human beings and animals and plants to live in. So civil society at various levels is a very active stakeholder and quite a better performer to implement multilateralism. Why does SDG 7 matter so much? In the long run, in World Risk Society, those who welcome nationalism and push back any idea of multilateralism and global cooperation will lose. Ulrich Beck has put it very shortly. He says, whoever draws the national card loses. So in this perspective, at the end of the day, nationalists will not be the winners, but the costs of their actions are enormous. If you think of challenging issues of humanity, one of the most challenging issues is global migration due to environmental destruction. This number of people, we are living in a world where the vast majority of people have to leave their home place due to environmental destruction, and not like it was decades ago due to civil wars or military actions or wars going on. This is something taking place already nowadays if you look at the statistics of UNHCR and so on and so on. And these numbers will rise. You also can raise the issue of the rising of sea level, where we have territory of states just falling under the sea in the South Pacific, raising questions, okay, what do we do with a state who does not have a territory anymore? And all of these questions means high risk of endangered human security. And this is also a cross-continental issue. Like if you have desertification in the Sahel region, it will not stay in the Sahel region, but people fleeing from their background because they cannot survive anymore in their countries, it will lead to a high number of states, political instability also being endangered in Europe. It's not like Europe is living a paradise on earth. It will be highly affected, and the costs of not taking action now in real politics will be very, very high. It will be not only a humanitarian catastrophe, but it will lead to a destabilization of political systems in stable countries like European countries as well, if the world will not look at it and have a kind of, foresight on it. SDG 17 clearly reminds states to focus on multilateralism, on global cooperation. As I said, it addresses civil society, the private sector as well, to participate in this challenge to make the world more sustainable. The diagnosis presented here is that among these three stakeholders for the implementation of the SDG 17, it actually is civil society who can be labeled as an active agent for global cooperation and multilateralism. And it can be shortly reduced to the statement by Patti Smith, the famous punk singer, who was saying, people have the power to redeem the work of fools. So there's a strong reshaping of power by civil society, getting more and more power in global politics. Let me come to my conclusion. The conclusion is pretty much related to Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker and Anders Wittmann's book on a report to the 50th anniversary of the Club of Rome. They were arguing in this book, come on, that the world needs a new enlightenment. And to do this, humanity needs to leave behind working in this, remember the cartoons, this closed container, in favor of a more systemic approach. And that actually will require us to rethink the organization of science and education as well. You as students, we as professors, we as scientists, we have to rethink what will be our contributions in order to address these global challenges. And humanity definitely needs something what Immanuel Kant in his writing on perpetual peace was already talking about, this notion of world citizenship, and to revitalize cosmopolitanism 2.0, to revitalize something. Immanuel Kant was the one, who talked in perpetual peace that the world should have a federation of free republics. This is something the world managed. We have United Nations here. We had this kind of proclamation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But what is in urgent need in the 21st century is another, Kant revisited. Whole UN Charter depends on the thinking of Immanuel Kant. But what is urgently needed with regard to rethink the organization of science and education is more global awareness, more cross-disciplinary research and education, in order that we all can contribute our input, how humanity actually can face these challenges. And as I say here, let me thank you for your kind attention with a graffiti from Banksy, saying there's always hope and there's always future in this sense. Although one might argue it's not too much time left. Thank you very much for your kind attention.